Senator Deacon, Nova Scotia. On debate.
Thank you, Your Honour. I commend Senator Monsillon for her service in sponsoring this bill. I'm the designated speaker for the CSG. I promise I won't be going 45 minutes, but I appreciate having an opportunity to speak about this bill. Honourable colleagues, this has been an incredibly tough few years for small businesses. Then, as retail businesses entered what likely was going to be their busiest time of what could be a good year, Canada Post workers went on strike, and a week later, on November 21st, they were conscripted into delivering a 2-month GST HST tax breaks on a random list of products, and this is no small task, as we've just heard. When the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister announced the GST HST holiday, the Prime Minister stated that for 2 months, Canadians are going to get a real break on everything they do. He went on to say that, and I quote, "Our government can't set prices at the checkout, but we can put more money in people's pockets, and that's going to give people the relief they need," end quote. The initial announcement also included a $250 working Canadians rebate to, in the words of the Prime Minister, quote, "Make sure you can buy the things you need and save for the things you want," end quote. Conversely, today, far too many Canadians are entirely focused on past due bills, not on savings accounts. This one-time proposed working Canadians rebate was intended to provide 18.7 million Canadians earning under $150,000 in 2023 with a $250 early spring check in early spring 25. When thinking about those struggling the most to afford groceries, I don't first think of people making $150,000 a year. That almost includes most people in this room. The next day, the Prime Minister stated that, and I quote, "What families need is to be able to afford their groceries," end quote. He's right. And you'll hear me repeat his statement quite often during this speech. But there is no GST on groceries. So what's the genesis of the November 21st policy announcement? It's been reported and not denied that the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister did not consult with their Cabinet or their caucus colleagues, who are accountable to their constituents. They also didn't consult with the Canada Revenue Agency officials responsible for providing businesses with GST guidance and compliance. In committee, when I asked the CRA officials if they'd been consulted, I received a blunt, one-word answer: no. I gather that 1 or 2 provinces were given a heads up, but most were not. Now there's an effort to shame the provinces into proactively participating. The Deputy Prime Minister repeated the word proactively in committee, but using that word in this situation I think is disingenuous at best. In her Globe and Mail column reporting on our National Finance Committee's excellent work, Shannon Proudfoot offered that this strategy is like, and I quote, "announcing unilaterally to your siblings that you've bought your parents a big screen TV for Christmas and they each owe you $500, end quote. That wouldn't have worked in my family. Bill C-78, dubbed as a Tax Break for All Canadians Act, just includes the GST and HST pauses with amendments to the Excise Tax Act. We should receive the $250 checks. Who should receive, I should say, the $250 checks is still being negotiated with the NDP. If passed, C-78 will create a $90 million hole in Nova Scotia's budget, months after the province announced several decisions to permanently reduce fees and taxes. Under its HST contract with Nova Scotia, the federal government is obliged to reimburse the province if their unilateral decision reduces aggregate provincial revenues by more than 1% in a calendar year. Given that contractual obligation, I'm deeply troubled that this government is trying to strong-arm my province into taking responsibility for this federal decision. But most disappointing is the fact that there is no consultation leading up to this policy announcement. Caucus was conscripted, federal departments were conscripted, Businesses were conscripted, and now efforts are underway to conscript the provinces. Colleagues, here is why I am completely against Bill C-78. First, there is no underlying logic to the random list of items selected for inclusion. The minister repeatedly stated in committee that the bill will eliminate GST and HST on groceries. However, there is no GST and HST on essential groceries, only on more expensive prepared foods. When you consider the list and who will benefit the most, it's certainly not those who need the most help. The majority of items on the list are non-essential, so families who are struggling to pay for groceries will see little benefit. This contradicts the PM's assertion that what families need is to be able to afford their groceries. Secondly, the department responsible for C-78's implementation and compliance, the CRA, was never consulted. This is a serious mistake, and small businesses are the ones who will pay the price. Maybe not in penalties, but certainly in GST or HST that is owing but not collected. Given that this is implemented over 2 different tax years, this is a risk and liability that's not going to go away anytime soon. Failure to consider implementation and compliance should be reason enough to reject this new policy or program. Third, federal departments that are actively pursuing policy goals opposite to this announcement were not consulted. For example, consuming junk food and candy are neither recommended by Health Canada, nor are they aligned with Bill C-252, a bill supported by this government, and that is at third reading here in the Senate. The purpose of Bill C-252 is to reduce the consumption of unhealthy foods, particularly by children. And again, what families need is to be able to afford their groceries. Fourth, this policy shows no consideration for small businesses who are being forced to implement this measure. Frontline staff will have to explain the randomness of the very specific list of qualifying items to customers and deal with any resulting frustration. I have personally heard small business owners expressing real concern over customer backlash if they refuse to believe the unexplainable. And there's an inverse cost to small businesses. This is going to be very inexpensive to implement for large businesses, but they'll have to do it twice for small businesses, and you're doing that as a one-off, often small mom-and-pop shop. Fifth, the implementation of the required point-of-sale changes favor our largest retailers who have the systems, the technical support, and the accounting expertise that enables them to make one central change and then roll that out nationally. Defending and explaining those changes to customers is easier because you've got a national advertising campaign available to them. And defending their actions to the CRA is unlikely to resemble that is facing small business. And as Senator Motion said, yes, we did hear words like reasonable efforts, honest mistakes, that a practical approach to compliance will be taken, but they will still be responsible for the GST or HST that they don't collect if they are in mistake, and they'll have to pay that for up to the next 2 years. So this is a significant risk for them if they don't do it right. Defending and explaining to customers the changes to customers in a big business is going to be much easier than it is for our smallest businesses. And I really wonder when we're going to start to respect our small businesses more than we certainly are showing that we do. Sixth, the Canadians who will benefit the most from the GST HST holiday are those who can afford to spend the most. Struggling families can only dream of being able to spend Finance Canada's example of $2,000 on qualifying goods, such as children's clothing, shoes, toys, diapers, books, video games, snacks for the house, restaurant meals. They are not the ones who will realize, the struggling families are not the ones who will realize GST or HS savings over the 2-month period. Colleagues, when announced, this one-time GST or HST holiday was accompanied by a proposed one-time $250 check for Canadians who earned up to $150,000 of income in 2023. It excludes those who are retired or disabled and doesn't include up to the top 5% of earners. That check is not targeted to those who need the most help. Quite the opposite. Again, what families need is to be able to afford their groceries. Colleagues, this giveaway was not in the Liberals' 2021 election platform. What was in that platform was a firm commitment to implement consumer-driven banking, otherwise known as open banking, by January 2023. Yet Minister Freeland has consistently and repeatedly delayed implementation, despite extensive consultations starting in 2018 over 5 years, with strong and enthusiastic support from the Senate Banking Committee in 2019, unrelenting support from Finance Department officials, the provinces, businesses, consumer groups, every other group you can consider, except for Canada's 5 big banks. Why do I raise this now? What does giving consumers secure control over their financial data have to do with C-78 and the announcement that was made on November 21st? It matters because had Minister Freeland implemented that 2021 election promise, Canadians would already be saving an average of $250 per person every year in the elimination of excess bank fees and costs. This is the finding of North Economics when comparing the profits of Canadian banks to those in the UK, where consumers do control their data. Consumers use their data to get cheaper loans, lower fees, higher interest on savings, and a reduced risk of fraud. Their study found $8.5 billion per year in excess profits in Canada's biggest banks. And that's because, based on this study, because open banking has not been implemented and our banks continue to use our data for their benefit, not for ours. Fitch Ratings has just reported that Canada's biggest banks benefit from a 13% year-over-year increase in revenues, and Saturday's Globe and Mail reported that executive bonuses at Canada's biggest banks jumped 12% in 2024 to $23.75 billion. Executive bonuses at Canada's biggest banks, $23.75 billion in 2024. If this government had fulfilled its 2021 election promise, Canadians would be benefiting from an average of $250 per year in savings at no cost to taxpayers. The government's delayed action on its election promise has caused Canadians to pay some of the highest fees and costs globally, and this is especially detrimental to those in greatest need. Colleagues, the decision we're debating is about the November 21st announcement and its initial representation in Bill C-78. It's not just about an estimated $1.7 billion for the GST portion of that announcement, but the provincial HST portion of $1.4 billion, because it will be paid by taxpayers whether the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister choose to honour the federal government's responsibility or not. And surely if we pass this bill, we are signalling our support for another $4.75 billion to be given away in $250 checks. That's a total of $7.85 billion. But now, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh wants the $250 to be delivered to all adults whose income is under $159,000 and who did not earn employment income in 2023. In 2022, according to StatsCan, there is roughly 33 million Canadians 18 years of age or older earning less than $150,000. That would be about $8.2 billion in $250 checks if Jagmeet Singh gets his wish. As a result, the total cost of the November 21st back-of-the-envelope announcement could reach over $11 billion. So what will this $8 or $11 billion expenditure do for Canadians? We know it does little for families who are struggling to afford groceries, but what's the opportunity cost of this policy announcement? What other major risks are we facing today? To answer that, I reflected back to the First Minister's meeting in Halifax last July, where the Premiers predicted the future we now find ourselves in, where our economic stability urgently requires the federal government to see security and defence as an economic issue. They were unanimous in their belief that continuing to ignore our 2% NATO spending target could cause enormous harm to businesses, employment, communities, and families. In the words of Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew, I quote, "I want Canadians to see this as a national security thing. It's an investment in our Canadian Armed Forces, but I encourage Canadians to think about this also as an investment in trade. If we're not meeting our responsibility to our NATO allies, It's going to have an impact on CUSMA. It's going to have an impact on the relationship. Just a few days after the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister made their November 21st announcement that we're debating today, President-elect Donald Trump posted his 25% tariff declaration, echoing the prediction of Canada's premiers. Investing up to $11 billion in junk food, beer, video games, Christmas trees, and other giveaways, rather than border security and defense, could cost us dearly. If the incoming president does what he continues to threaten, January 21st will mark the beginning of a devastating recession for Canada, regardless of any retaliatory tariffs that Canada may impose. In the words of former Bank of Canada Governor David Dodge in his testimony to the National Finance Committee, it's a little candy today for pain down the road, end quote. Colleagues, when the Prime Minister called me and granted me the honour of being appointed to the chamber, he made one request of me. You've heard me say it before. His request is, challenge the government. He made a similar request to many of you. We are the only parliamentary body to meaningfully consider this policy. We are generally deferential to spending bills in this body. However, when faced with such an ill-considered, decidedly unserious policy, and this bill, in the context of an increasingly dangerous world, awash with security risks and economic uncertainty, we cannot rest on tradition. Remember the PM's announcement, quote, what families need is to be able to afford their groceries, end quote. Bill C-78 doesn't help them. However, $11 billion could go a long ways towards demonstrating how seriously we take North American and NATO security and defense, potentially helping to avoid a devastating recession. Colleagues, please consider what it might cost us if we endorse this ill-conceived bill. I know this is a money bill, and it's the government's prerogative to spend money however they like. However, C-78 has demonstrated such profound disregard for small businesses, such profound disregard for where we find ourselves today, that I cannot support it, not in any way. Thank you, colleagues.